Stratford, of course, is the birthplace of the nation's most celebrated playwright, William Shakespeare. And in July, the University of Warwick, in conjunction with the Royal Shakespeare Company, is hosting a major conference examining the links between the works of Shakespeare and the law. Paul Raffield is the organiser.
The idea really is that the conference should provide a focus for an interdisciplinary approach to law. The idea that law isn't just a discipline that exists in its own tight vacuum.
Why make the connection between Shakespeare and the law?
Law is not just a system of rules, of formal rules. Law, in its broadest sense, is to do with the nature of relationships within society. And so it seems to me obvious that a way of representing those relationships in society is through drama.
Did Shakespeare adhere to the laws of libel and slander as we know them today?
The extraordinary thing about the theatre was its licence, the licence it had at a time of great censorship. I mean, all printing was subject to censorship by the stationer's office. The theatre got away with it in a way that no other medium of expression did.
What can lawyers of today learn from Shakespeare? Principally,
they can learn from Shakespeare's humanity. The idea that law is not a system of rules or doctrines or dogmas even, but that it's to do with our relationships with each other in society. The notion of community is central not only to Shakespeare and Shakespeare's plays, it's central to the idea of drama generally. Drama is a representation of community. And I think lawyers often, be they academic lawyers or professional practitioners, often forget that law is to do with people and not just to do with the regulation of their lives, but the way in which we can enhance people's lives. And Shakespeare makes various suggestions as to how those lives can be enhanced, but always in the context of society, that we don't exist in a vacuum.
It's thought that Shakespeare's legal knowledge could have been the result of his living in a particularly litigious age.
There's a period in Shakespeare's life, when he's in his early 20s, that we call Shakespeare's lost years. We don't know where he was. He might have left Stratford-upon-Avon. He hadn't yet started his career as an actor and playwright. And one of the theories is that he spent those lost years as a lawyer's clerk. People argue that because there's a lot of knowledge of the law in the plays. But my instinct is that's probably not how he spent that time. However, he lived in a very litigious age, and anybody involved in business dealings the way that he was involved in the management of his theatre company, and in property dealings, he was a bit of an accumulator of property. Anybody with that sort of experience would sooner or later have got into litigation, and indeed we have surviving records of legal cases Shakespeare was involved with. So he'd have just picked up a lot of legal knowledge through his day-to-day life.
Which specific legal themes did Shakespeare make reference to, and in which plays?
Some of the plays that are most interesting for Shakespeare's treatment of the law are his comedies. Two in particular. Measure for Measure is a play deeply concerned with questions of justice, but also with a very particular interest in the marriage law. There's a reference at one point in that play to someone having a pre-contract for marriage. And according to the law of the time, once you actually made a verbal promise of marriage, the marriage was legally binding, even though you had not yet gone before a priest. And the whole plot of Measure for Measure turns on a debate about the extent to which a marriage is or is not complete on the basis of that pre-contract. So that's a very specific example. More generally, The Merchant of Venice would be perhaps Shakespeare's most thoroughgoing explanation of the law. You remember that's the play that begins with a bond, a contract, where in order to get a loan for his friend, one of the characters agrees with a moneylender, Shylock the Jew, that if the loan is not repaid, he'll have to give up a pound of his flesh. If the loan isn't repaid, the case goes to court. And a clever young lawyer, who actually turns out to be Portia, the heroine of the play in disguise, resolves the case. And there's a particularly interesting moment in that law court scene where we see Shylock with his knife and his scales about to measure the pound of flesh. And I think for Shakespeare's audience, visually, that would have conjured up, been a sort of parody of the image of justice. The traditional image of justice, we still see her on the top of the Old Bailey, has a sword in one hand and the scales representing balance or fairness on the other. So I think Shylock, with his scales and knife, is a sort of parody of the figure of justice.
Would Shakespeare's audience have been aware of his legal references?
Shakespeare was always writing for several different audiences simultaneously. A lot of his audience, the so-called groundlings, the people who just paid a penny to stand and watch the plays, probably wouldn't have picked up on the more sophisticated references. But the audience who paid a few more pence and had the seats, many of them were lawyers. There were very close links between the profession of the law and in particular the training of lawyers at the Inns of Court, links between them and the theatre. Several other dramatists at the time were actually trained lawyers, and plays were often put on as festivities for the trainee lawyers. Plays like Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Comedy of Errors, we know were performed at the Inns of Court. And then, of course, he was also writing for the court audience, a highly educated audience who would have been deeply versed in the common law as well as the law of the ancients, of the classics.